The egg cracked on the wrong side of the mountain. Nobody noticed. The other eggs in the clutch were still sealed tight, warm under their mother's wing. The nesting ground was quiet. The hatchling that pushed through the shell first did not make a sound. She was too cold to make a sound. She lay on her side in the dark and blinked at a sky she had never seen before, and the sky was grey and enormous and full of wind. She was golden, pale gold, the color of old honey, small enough to fit in two cupped hands. Her wings were wet and folded wrong, and she could not fix them. She tried to stand. Her legs did not agree on the direction. She fell sideways into the roots of an apple tree and stayed there, too tired to try again. The tree was at the edge of something, a fence, though she did not know the word yet. On the other side of the fence, there were rows of other trees, and between the rows, a man was walking. He was not large as humans went. He wore old boots and a coat the color of mud. He carried a bucket in one hand and nothing in the other. He was not young and he was not old. He walked like someone who had walked the same path many mornings and expected to walk it many more. He was not watching the fence line. He was watching the ground, thinking about something private. Then he looked up. He saw her. She watched his face. She did not know what his face meant yet. She would later learn to read human faces very well, but in that moment she was a week old, and she only knew that he had stopped walking, and that he was looking at her, and that she could not run. He did not run either. He set down the bucket. He walked to the fence slowly, the way you walk when you do not want to startle something small. He crouched down on the other side of the roots and looked at her for a long time. She could see him thinking. She could not hear what he was thinking, but his face did not look like fear. It looked more like the feeling before a decision. He said something. She did not understand the words. The sound was low and even, not loud, not sharp. Then he reached into his coat and pulled it off his shoulders, and he leaned over the fence carefully and wrapped it around her. It was warm. It smelled like the man and like the earth and like something she had no name for. She did not pull away. She was too cold to pull away, and something in the warmth felt like it was meant for her, which was a strange thing to feel when you had been alive for less than 2 weeks. He picked her up, coat and all, and carried her. She let him. She was aware this was probably not what a dragon was supposed to do. She could not think of a better option. He carried her to the boundary stone at the edge of his property. The stone was carved with old marks that meant the line between his land and the territory beyond. He seemed to know what it meant. He set her down on the far side of the stone, gently, in a patch of grass where the ground was dry. He unwrapped his coat from around her and pulled it back over his own shoulders. Then he went to one of the apple trees near the fence and picked a single apple, a small one, red and firm. He set it beside her on the grass. He looked at her one more time. Then he turned around and walked back to his bucket and picked it up and kept walking his rows. He did not look over his shoulder. She watched him until he disappeared between the trees. Then she looked at the apple. She had never eaten an apple. She had never eaten anything at all, technically. She bit into it. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She sat in the grass and ate the whole apple and thought about the man. She thought about the coat. She thought about the fact that he had not run. She thought about the fact that he had not looked back, and she decided that was the most interesting part. He had been afraid. She had smelled it faintly, the way you can smell rain before it arrives, but he had decided it did not matter, and then it had not mattered, and he had gone back to his work. She finished the apple. She found her legs were working better now. She stood up, tested her wings, and began the long walk back to the nesting ground. She did not tell anyone about the apple. She did not tell anyone about the man. But she thought about him for a long time that night, curled under her mother's wing with her clutchmates sealed in their shells around her. She thought, he did something for me, and he will never know my name, and he did not ask for anything back. She thought, I want to give him something. She did not know what yet. She was very young, but she had time, and she had just learned something important, that you could decide a thing did not matter, and then it would not matter, and you could keep walking your rows. She was going to need that lesson. What she was about to spend the next 20 years doing would require a great deal of deciding that certain things did not matter. She closed her eyes. She did not know the man's name yet. She would learn it. She was going to learn a great many things. Above the planet, in a vessel that no one on the ground could see, a device recorded the interaction and filed it under Species Contact, Incidental. Threat Level, 0, Priority, None. The device was wrong about the priority. It would take a long time for anyone to realize that. 3 years after the apple, Solara flooded Dale's cellar. She had not meant to, that was the problem. She had spent 6 months studying the water table under his property, tracing the underground paths with her nose pressed to the hillside soil, following the wet stone smell down into the dark earth the way her mother had taught her to track rain. She had been very careful. She had been very thorough. She had moved 12 large rocks and 3 smaller ones, and she had redirected the underground spring with what she genuinely believed was a great deal of skill for a 3-year-old dragon. The spring, it turned out, had its own opinions. She watched from the tree line above the farm as Dale came out of his cellar door with a bucket, then with another bucket, then with a third bucket. He stood in his yard and looked at the cellar and said something she did not understand, but the tone of it was clear. Then he went back in with the bucket again. He spent 3 days bailing out the cellar. Solara spent 3 days watching him do it. She did not sleep much. She was trying to understand where her calculations had gone wrong. She was also trying to understand the words he was saying because she had begun, 3 months earlier, to study his language. She did this alone, in a narrow canyon 2 ridges away from the nesting ground. She pressed her mouth against the rock walls to muffle the sound, which helped some, and made sounds that she thought were close to what she had heard, which they were not. She had no teacher. She had only her ears and her memory and a growing collection of flat stones with symbols scratched into them, her own private system for writing down sounds she did not yet understand. On the 4th morning, Dale finished bailing out the cellar. He stood in his yard and looked up at the sky for a while. He did not look angry anymore. He looked tired and slightly confused, and then he shrugged and went inside. Solara scratched a new symbol on a stone. She had decided it meant more research needed. Her brother Riven found the stones 3 weeks later. He was 4 years older than her, indigo-scaled, already long enough to cast a serious shadow. He had been looking for her because their mother had asked, and because Riven, being Riven, always did what their mother asked. He found the cache under the riverbed ledge without much difficulty. He was a better tracker than she was, which she admitted privately and never out loud. He pulled out the stones one by one and looked at them. There were 43. He could not read the symbols. Nobody could read the symbols except Solara, but he could see that they were deliberate and organized and that there were a great many of them. When Solara came back from her canyon practice that evening, Riven was sitting beside the riverbed with the stones arranged in front of him. He said, "What are these?" She said, "Records." He said, "Records of what?" She sat down across from him. She thought about how to explain it. She said, "There is a human on the other side of the boundary stone. He did something for me when I was very small. I am studying him so I can give him something back." Riven looked at the 43 stones. He looked at her. He said, "You have been doing this for 3 years." She said, "Yes." He said, "Have you told Mother?" She said, "No." He said, "Have you told anyone?" She said, "I'm telling you now." Riven picked up one of the stones and turned it over in his claws. He put it back down. He looked at the collection for a long time. Then he said, "What did he do?" "The human." She said, "He wrapped me in his coat. He left an apple. He didn't look back." Riven was quiet for a while. Then he said, "And you've been studying him for 3 years because of an apple." She said, "It was more than the apple." He said, "You flooded his cellar, didn't you?" It was not a question. She looked at the river instead of at him. She said, "I was trying to help with the dry season problem. The spring moved the wrong direction." Riven rubbed the side of his face with one claw. He looked like he was deciding something. Then he said, "Are you eating enough?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Are you sleeping?" She said, mostly. He stood up. He looked down at the 43 stones. He said, I'm not going to tell Mother, but I want you to know that what you're doing is strange, even for you. She said, I know. He said, what are you planning to give him? She said, I don't know yet. I have to understand him better first. Riven made a sound she had no word for and walked back toward the nesting ground. She watched him go. Then she picked up the stone that meant more research needed and held it for a moment. She put it at the front of the collection. It seemed like the right place for it. Far above, in the observation vessel that circled the planet in a high silent orbit, Sector Observer Fenn had been reviewing the file on the dragon nesting ground. His partner archivist Doss was reading something else, something he found more interesting, which was most things. Fenn typed, Juvenile Dragon, Gold Class, Age 3 Standard Cycles, Anomalous Behavioral Pattern Noted. Subject appears to be maintaining a record archive. Purpose unknown. No threat indicators. Possible obsessive developmental variants. He paused. He added, recommend continued low-priority monitoring. He looked at the cellar incident one more time. He added, human demonstrates unusual patience with environmental disruption. Filed under temperament outlier. Then he closed the file and looked for something more interesting to do. There was, as usual, nothing. Some things you can only learn slowly. Solara learned Dale's language by the time she was 7. Not perfectly. She could not yet say the soft sounds that lived in the middle of words, and some of the vowels came out wrong when she was tired. But she could understand most of what he said. This was the important part. She practiced every evening in the canyon, and she stopped muffling her voice against the rocks after the first year, when she understood that the canyon's shape did the muffling for her. She talked to the canyon walls as if they were Dale. She asked them questions. She answered for them. It was strange. She did not care that it was strange. She learned that he talked to his trees. He did not do it loudly. He did it the way you do something you know is slightly foolish, but that you are going to keep doing anyway. Walking the rows in the morning, he would say things to the trees. Things like, you're leaning too far left, fix that, or you did well this year, or sometimes just the name of a tree said like a greeting. Solara found this completely reasonable. She did not know why anyone would find it otherwise. When she was 8, Dale's daughter Nara came for the anniversary of her mother's death. Solara had known for 2 years that Dale's wife was gone. She had worked it out from patterns, the space in the house that felt like an absence, the way Dale moved differently on certain dates, slower and more careful, like someone walking on a floor they were not sure would hold. She had not known what it meant exactly until she watched Nara arrive. Nara was tall, with her father's way of moving, practical and without extra motion. She brought food. They sat at the table and ate. Then they went outside and sat on the porch steps, side by side, and they did not talk. They sat for 2 hours. Sometimes one of them would say something small, she saw that bird again, or the fence post on the east side needs fixing, and then silence would come back. They were not sad the way Solara had expected. They were something else. They were together in the sadness, which made the sadness smaller, or at least made it possible to sit beside without it taking over. Solara watched from the ridge above the orchard and did not understand what she was seeing. She scratched a symbol into a stone that meant, examine this further. She examined it further for 6 years. At age 10, Dale was cheated by a merchant. She had seen merchants before, passing through on the road below the orchard. This one arrived with 2 wagons and a lot of words, and left with Dale's entire season of stored apple harvest, giving him roughly a third of what it was worth. Solara knew it was wrong because she had been watching the valley market from altitude for 5 years, and she knew what apples sold for. She was furious in a way that surprised her. It felt like something had been taken from her personally, which was strange because she had no apple harvest. She spent 3 days deciding what to do about it. She could destroy the wagons. She thought about this seriously. She dismissed it because Dale would not want that. She had learned by now that Dale had specific feelings about large, irreversible things done on his behalf by forces he had not asked to intervene. He would not have used those words, but she had watched him long enough to know the shape of his preferences. She found the merchant's secondary stock instead. He kept it in a rented barn outside the valley, hidden from the people who collected taxes. Solara knew where it was because she knew where everything in a 3-ridge radius was. She found the barn. She remembered exactly which council member in the valley had once said the words unfair practice out loud in a tone that suggested he meant them. And she waited until he rode past the barn on his usual route. And then she made a very small noise from inside the barn, the kind of noise that makes someone curious rather than frightened. He investigated. He found the hidden stock. He was, as it turned out, very interested in it. The merchant was fined heavily. Dale received a portion of the fine as the affected party. He looked confused about this for a week, and then grateful, and then he went back to his orchard. Solara scratched the word subtle on a stone and underlined it 3 times. At 13, she finally understood what she had seen on Nara's visit when she was 8. She was watching them again. It was another anniversary. They did this every year, and something settled into place in her understanding the way a large rock settles when it finds the right position. She understood now that what they were doing was not about sadness. It was about saying, this person existed and I remember. It was about making sure the memory had somewhere to live for a few hours outside of just one person's head where it could breathe. She sat very still on the ridge for a long time after they went inside. She thought about what she wanted to give Dale. She had been thinking about this for 13 years. She had tried to fix his water supply and flooded his cellar. She had learned his language. She had learned the names of his trees. She had watched him eat alone on winter evenings, and she had watched him give away a third of his harvest to a neighbor whose crop had failed, without being asked and without mentioning it again. She knew now what the gift should be. She had known for a while, actually, but now she was ready to admit it. She went to find a valley, a specific one. She had been thinking about a particular valley for 2 years. It was hidden, sheltered, fed by a clean stream, 3 miles from Dale's property. Nobody used it. Nothing lived in it that would object to being moved. It was the right size. She began to plan. Riven said nothing for a very long time. He stood at the entrance of the valley and he looked at what his sister had built, and he did not say anything. Solara stood beside him and waited. She had gotten very good at waiting. It was one of the more useful things the last 15 years had taught her. The valley was small enough to feel private and large enough to matter. A clean stream ran through the center of it. The walls were pale stone, smooth in some places, rough in others, and every flat surface had been carved, not with pictures, with words. Small words, careful words, cut at a height that a standing human could read without straining, which Solara had measured exactly. The language was his language. She had practiced the letter shapes for 2 years before she started cutting, on loose stones first, until her cuts were clean and even. Along the stream there was a garden, not wild, planted. Every plant labeled with a small flat stone marker, 2 names on each stone, one in her language, one in his. The apple varieties from his orchard were all here. 7 kinds, and beside them the wildflower that grew along the east fence that Dale's wife had picked every summer when she was alive, which Solara knew because Dale had told the fence post about it once, just once in October, in the way he talked to things when he thought he was alone. The herb he kept on his windowsill. The cedar that stood in the far corner of his property, planted the year Nara was born. 31 plants. She had not forgotten any of them. The inscriptions on the wall covered 15 years of mornings. Not all of them, there were too many mornings for that, but she had chosen carefully. The morning he gave the harvest away and said nothing. The morning he found a hawk with a broken wing in his orchard and built it a wooden box and fed it mice for 3 weeks until it flew. The morning after a very hard winter when he went out before sunrise and stood among his trees for a long time, just stood there, and then he straightened his back and said something to the trees that Solara could not hear from the ridge, and he went inside and made something to eat, and the next morning he was back at work. Ordinary mornings, every one of them ordinary, that was the point. She had thought about this for a long time, the way you think about something you know is important but have not found the right words for yet, and what she had finally understood was that the ordinariness was the thing worth keeping, not the big moments. The big moments were easy to remember, the ordinary ones dissolved. 50 years from now, 100 years, no one would remember the morning Dale straightened his back in the cold and went inside to make something to eat. No one except the valley. Riven turned to look at her. He said, "How long did the carving take?" She said, 4 years for the walls. The garden took 3, the binding took 1 more. He said, "The binding." She said, "Yes." He said, "You used an old binding." She said, "I asked Mother about them when I was 12. I told her I was curious about preservation techniques. She explained them. I took notes." Riven looked at the walls again. An old binding meant the valley would not decay. The plants would grow and be replaced by their own seeds. The stone would not crack. The inscriptions would not fade. It was dragoncraft that most of her generation had never used, because there was rarely a reason to make something permanent. Territory markings did not need it. Hordes did not need it. This kind of binding was for monuments. He said, "This will outlast everyone who is alive right now." She said, "Yes, that's the idea." He was quiet again. She let him be quiet. A bird went across the sky above the valley. The stream made its sounds. Then he said, "He doesn't know any of this is here." She said, "Not yet." He said, "What if he doesn't want it?" She had thought about this question many times. She had an answer she had worked on for 2 years, and she had a shorter answer that was more honest. She gave him the shorter one. She said, "Then I will have spent 15 years learning to understand a person. That will have been its own thing." Riven sat down on a flat rock near the garden. He looked at the cedar sapling in the corner, the one that matched the tree on Dale's property. He looked at the wildflower. He looked at the walls. He said, "You wrote about the cellar, didn't you?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Read me what you wrote." She walked to the section on the south wall and read it to him. She had written it honestly, the wrong calculations, the 3 days of bailing, the bucket, the silence after. She had written, he did not curse the water or the sky. He worked until the work was done, and then he shrugged and went inside. Riven sat with that for a moment. Then he stood up and walked to the east wall where there was still a section of bare stone, a gap she had left because she could not find the right words for it. He said, "What goes here?" She said, "I don't know yet. I left it in case something happens that needs to be there." He looked at the blank space. He said, "Can I help finish it?" She looked at him. She said, "You think it's worth finishing?" He said, "I think you're going to give it to him whether I help or not." He picked up a carving tool from the ground, one she had left near the wall. He looked at her and said, "Tell me what shape the letters should be." She showed him. They worked until the light changed. He was slower than her, less practiced, but his lines were steady. When they stopped, the blank section was still mostly blank, but it was less blank than before. Far above, the observation vessel had been running passive scans of the valley for 6 months. The binding had registered 3 weeks ago as something the sensor system did not have a category for. Fen had flagged it and sent a query to the central database. The central database had returned a classification, permanent structure, class 4. This classification had been used 11 times in the history of the assembly. All 11 times, it had been used for monuments built by entire species to mark the end of something or the beginning of something. The relevant examples included a memorial for a species-wide extinction event, 2 planetary capitals, and a monument marking first contact between the assembly's founders. The database listed the minimum resource requirement for a Class 4 structure as coordinated effort of at least 40 skilled individuals over a minimum of 8 cycles. Fen looked at the sensor data again. He looked at the single golden dragon working alone in a hidden valley. He called for Archivist DOS. For the first time in a long time, DOS put down what he was reading without being asked. She landed in the orchard just as the sky was going from dark to gray. Not crashing, not circling, not announcing herself the way the old stories said dragons were supposed to. She just came down between 2 rows of apple trees and folded her wings and stood there, and the grass bent a little under her weight, and the morning went on around her. A bird in one of the trees kept singing. Fog was sitting in the low parts of the ground. The air smelled like wet soil and something almost ready to grow. The house at the end of the path had a light in it. The door opened before she had decided what to do with her hands, her claws, the front part of her, the waiting part. Dale came out in his boots and his old work coat with something hot in a mug. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her the same way he had looked at her when she was a week old and tangled in tree roots, not afraid, assessing. The same tired eyes, a little more lined now, doing the same work they had always done, looking at a thing and deciding what to make of it. He said, "Morning." She said, in his language, "Good morning, Dale." He was still for a moment. Then he took a sip from his mug. He said, "You speak." She said, "I have been practicing." He looked at her for a while longer. He said, "You're the one from the roots, long time ago." She said, "Yes." He said, "I hoped you made it." She said, "I did." He came down the porch steps and sat on the bottom one. She sat in the orchard, which put them roughly at the same level. He held his mug in both hands. He said, "How old are you?" She told him. He thought about the number and what it meant and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "So you were just hatched?" She said, "Almost exactly." He looked at his trees. He looked back at her. He said, "You didn't come here just to tell me that." She said, "No, I have something to show you. It will take most of the day, if you have the time." He looked at the orchard. She could see him calculating what needed doing, what could wait, what the weather was going to be. She had watched him make this calculation hundreds of times from the ridge. He looked back at her and said, "I'll get my boots." He was already wearing his boots. He went inside and came back with a second coat. He offered it to her as a joke, she thought, or maybe not entirely a joke. She declined politely. They walked 3 miles through the hills at human pace. She matched her steps to his. She had practiced this too, though not as much as the language, and she was more self-conscious about it. He did not seem to mind. He asked questions, not many and not fast. What did she eat? Where did she sleep? Was the nesting ground far? She answered all of them. She asked him in return how the east fence was holding up. He gave her a look she could not quite read, and then said it was fine, fixed it 2 years ago. She had watched him fix it. She did not mention this. At the entrance to the valley she stopped. He stopped beside her. The entrance was narrow, framed on both sides by stone, and through it the valley opened up, catching the morning light. She let him look before they went in. She wanted him to choose to enter, not to be led. He walked in. She followed at a distance and did not make a sound. He went to the walls first. He stood in front of the first inscription and read it slowly. She watched his face and could not read it. He moved along the wall. He stopped at a section, read it again, moved on. He did not look at her. He was reading the way you read something when you are not sure you are reading it correctly, going back over the words to make sure they say what you thought they said. Then he found the garden. He walked into it slowly. He looked at the markers. She saw the moment he found the wildflower, his wife's wildflower, the one from the east fence. He crouched down and looked at it for a long time without touching it. He found the cedar sapling in the corner, the one that matched his tree, and he put his hand on it. He kept his hand there. He was not crying. He was doing the thing she had seen him and Nara do on the anniversary, being in it, staying in it, letting the memory have somewhere to be. He walked the whole valley, 2 hours. She sat near the entrance and waited. He looked at every inscription. He read them at his own pace. Sometimes he stopped and stood still for a while before moving on. When he came back to her, he looked older and more settled at the same time. The way people look when they have just put something down that they did not know they were still carrying. He said, "Why?" She said, "You wrapped me in your coat. You left an apple. You walked away without looking back. I was too young to know what that was. It took me a long time to figure it out. But when I did, I wanted you to know that it was seen, that everything after it was seen, that someone was paying attention." He looked at the valley. He said, "I didn't do anything." She said, "You did something and you didn't ask for anything back. That's not nothing. That's one of the harder things. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, Nara should see this. She said, I was hoping you would say that. He looked at her, he said, the plants, they'll keep. She said, they'll keep. He said, and the walls. She said, the walls will keep. He looked at the cedar sapling one more time from where he stood. Then he looked at her and said, come for supper, if you can fit. She was, in fact, far too large to fit in his house. He said it anyway. She said, maybe I'll sit in the orchard. He said, that works too. In orbit above them, Fen and Dos had been watching in real time for 2 hours. Dos, who had filed reports on 41 civilizations over 3 centuries and who made a point of never appearing impressed by anything, had not typed a single word since the man entered the valley. He was watching the sensor feed with both upper eyes and the small lower ones that he only used when he was concentrating. Fen said, I'm going to file the Tier 1 contact report now. Dos said, file it for both species. Fen said, which one surprises you more? Dos was quiet for a moment. He said, the human, the dragon did something extraordinary. The human had no idea he started it. Fen began to type. He got through one sentence and stopped. He looked at the feed. Dale was walking back through the valley toward the entrance, and Solara was walking beside him, and neither of them was saying anything, and it was an ordinary Tuesday morning, and the light in the valley was very good. Fen decided the report could wait a few more minutes. The report took Fen 6 months to write. This was not because he was slow. He had filed contact reports on 47 species in his career, most of them in under 2 standard weeks. The delay was because every framework he tried to apply to what he had observed broke before he got very far into it. He would get 3 paragraphs in and realize that what he was writing was not accurate, not because the facts were wrong, but because the categories were wrong, and every time he tried to choose new categories, those turned out to be wrong too. Dos watched him do this for 6 months. He did not offer help. This was partly because Dos found Fen's difficulty interesting, and partly because Dos was having the same problem with his own notes, which he was choosing not to mention. The core issue was the dragon. The assembly classified developing species based on threat assessment, resource use, social complexity, and long-range expansion patterns. Dragons scored extremely high on most of these. They were large, long-lived, intelligent, and territorial. By standard model, they should have ranked as either a significant threat or a significant trading partner, depending on approach. The model was simple. The model worked for most species. Solara had spent her entire juvenile period, the years that the model said determined a species' developmental trajectory, building a permanent monument to one ordinary person's life. Not to a king, not to a great warrior, not to a figure who had changed the course of events. To a farmer who got up early and talked to his trees and gave apples away to people worse off than himself and had once spent 3 days bailing water out of his cellar with a bucket. The monument was structurally the most sophisticated thing either species had produced. It would outlast every living creature currently on the planet. It had been built by one individual, alone, over 15 years, and the intended audience was a man who had no idea it was coming. This did not fit anywhere. Fen tried filing it under altruistic behavior, complex. He read what he had written and deleted it. He tried individual outlier, no pattern implications. He deleted that too. He tried social bonding, cross-species, atypical. He closed the file and went to look at something else for a week. When he came back, he called Dos over. He said, tell me what you see. Dos looked at the collected data on both species. He looked at the valley, the inscriptions, the garden, the old binding. He looked at the footage of Dale reading the wall, crouching by the wildflower, putting his hand on the cedar sapling. He looked at all of it for a long time and said nothing. Then he said, we have been measuring the wrong thing. Fen said, explain. Dos said, we measure what a species produces, what it builds, what it takes, how far it spreads. We have never measured what a species causes in something else, what it makes other things become. Fen looked at the footage of Dale walking back from his fence on an ordinary morning 20 years ago, carrying a bucket, not looking back over his shoulder. Doss said that man did not build anything, he did not invent anything, he did not fight anyone. He lived on a small piece of land and grew apples and spoke to his trees, and something vast and ancient and older than his civilization spent its entire childhood deciding that his life was worth making permanent. What does that tell you? Fen thought about it, then he said, "It tells me the apple mattered." Doss said, "It tells you that the apple produced a 20-year consequence that will outlast every person on that planet, which means that when you are trying to understand a species, looking at what they build is not enough. You have to look at what happens around them when they are not trying to do anything at all." Fen was quiet. Then he wrote one sentence in the report. He read it back to himself. It was the first sentence in 6 months that he did not want to delete. It said, "We have been measuring human civilization by its outputs. We should have been measuring it by what it causes in others." He kept going. 6 months after Dale first saw the valley, Nara came. Dale had told her about it plainly, in the practical tone he used for things he did not fully have words for. He had said, "There is a valley 3 miles out. A dragon built something there. It has to do with your mother's flower and the cedar and some other things. You should go see it." Nara was not someone who needed more explanation than that. She put on her boots and went. Solara met her at the entrance. They looked at each other. Nara was her father's daughter in posture and in silence, comfortable with quiet, not in any hurry to fill it. She looked Solara over the way Dale had looked her over, that same assessing calm. Then she went into the valley. She came back an hour later. She said, "You wrote about the anniversary visits." Solara said, "Yes." She said, "You watched us every year." Solara said, "Yes, I am sorry if that is unsettling." Nara thought about it. She said, "It's strange, but you understood what it was. I didn't know anyone outside the two of us understood what it was." Solara said, "It took me a long time. I was 8 when I first saw it. I was 14 before I understood it." Nara looked back at the valley. She said, "He's not going to understand the scale of this. He's never going to fully understand it, you know that." Solara said, "Yes." Nara said, "Does that bother you?" Solara thought about the answer honestly. She said, "No, the point was never for him to understand the scale. The point was for the thing to exist." Nara nodded slowly, in the way of someone who is not sure they agree but respects the answer. She looked at the cedar sapling in the corner. She said, "I want to add something, a marker for him when the time comes." She looked at Solara. "Is there room?" Solara looked at the east wall, at the section that was still not entirely finished, the gap she had left because she had not found the right words for it yet. She said, "There is room." 3 weeks later, Dale sat in the valley on a flat stone that was exactly the right height for a person to sit comfortably on, which it was because Solara had measured it. He had brought an apple from his orchard. He cut it into slices with his penknife, the way he always did. He held out half towards Solara. She ate her half carefully. He ate his. Neither of them said anything. The stream made its sound. The plants in the garden moved slightly in a small wind. The inscriptions on the walls held the light. It was, by any measure, an ordinary Tuesday. Above them, the observation vessel held its orbit. Fen was watching the feed. He had finished the report 2 weeks ago. He had sent it. The assembly had flagged the system for priority review and scheduled a formal contact evaluation, which would take years and involve many people who had not been here for any of this and who would read about it in his report and in Doss's supplementary notes, and who would not fully understand it, which Fen had accepted. He watched Dale eat his apple in the valley that would outlast everyone. After a while, Fen opened the small container of food he had brought to his station and cut a piece of it and ate it in silence. He did not examine why, he just did it. Doss, from across the observation deck, saw him do it. He said nothing. He turned back to his work, but for just a moment, something in his expression shifted. It was the closest thing to being moved that 300 years of watching civilizations had left him capable of. He did not mention this in his notes. Some things, he had decided, were not for the report.